Thank you all for joining us today. We will get started in just a moment and allow everyone a chance to join us. Thank you all for joining us today. We will get started in just a few minutes and allow everyone a chance to get logged in. If you do have any initial questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A box and we'll address them at the session at the end. We're seeing some folks come in. Thank you all for joining us. It's good to see everyone this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're at. We'll give folks another minute or so to log in here with us. Again, if you do have initial questions, feel free to share those in the Q&A box. Thank you all for joining us today. It's good to see everyone. We're just giving folks another minute or so to log in. If you have initial questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A box for after the presentations are finished. Thank you all for joining us today. I will now turn it over to ASH Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
Thank you so much, Megan. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar to commemorate World No Tobacco Day. And this year, the World Health Organization is calling on the global community, all of us, to unite in unmasking the appeal of tobacco and exposing industry tactics. So today we will focus on this, but with a focus on three topics. First one is on greenwashing, how the tobacco industry uses environmental policies and platforms to whitewash its image and to use it as a corporate social responsibility platform. You'll hear about filter fraud, about how cigarette filters not only don't do anything for health, but they mask the product and also harm the environment. And you also hear about menthol and how menthol is still widely used by the tobacco industry to make it more appealing for smokers and so on and so forth. So we'll have very interesting presentations today. I also want to take a minute first before we start to congratulate this year's World No Tobacco Day awardees. I will not be able to mention them all, but I want to mention at least the special awards. The ones for first the WHO Director General Special Awards that went to the Ministry of Health of the Republic of Mauritius for its stellar implementation of the WHO Framework on Convention on Tobacco Control, the Tobacco Treaty, and the Maldives for its efforts in tobacco control. And that just recently, last week, became the first country with basically a de facto sales ban on tobacco products that will be implemented to anyone born after 2009. So I think that's the right date. But anyways, the first country that now has a generation ban on the book. I also want to mention this WHO Director General Special Recognition Certificate that went to the Global Center for Good Governance in Tobacco Control, GGTC, for their excellent work in monitoring and exposing tobacco industry interference in health and environmental policies. So congratulations again to the awardees for this year. So we have four panelists today who will address the issues of industry unmasking the appeal, and then there'll be plenty of opportunities for Q&A. Feel free to use the icon at the bottom of the screen and use the Q&A function to direct the questions to any of the speakers on the panel. So we'll start with our very first panelist, Professor Nicholas Hopkinson, who's a clinical academic based at the National Heart and Lung Institute of the Imperial College on the Royal Brompton Hospital. and he's also involved with ASH in the UK, who will explain why no amount of greenwashing can obscure the environmental harm caused by the tobacco industry. Nick is also one of the authors of the report mandated from by the COP11, the Conference of the Parties of the FCTC, on the topic of environmental harms that will be presented to the COP this October. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Give me a second while you get the sharing your screen function. Perfect.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and for the introduction. The subject of greenwashing is a big one, but I'm going to keep to time hopefully, and talk a little bit about what it is specifically with relation to the tobacco industry, and the basic fundamental reason why it is just nonsense when the tobacco industry does this. So greenwashing in general is where a company misleads the public to believe that a company or entity is actually doing something for the environment, or more for the environment than it actually is. So that's something that is apparent across an enormous number of companies producing many different things. And is a whole issue of itself as to whether these sorts of corporate social responsibility efforts are actually a real thing, or a good thing. When we're talking about the tobacco industry, I think there are two sort of specific things that we need to bear in mind. The first is the very clear tobacco industry agenda to divert, distract, delay the actions that we know and are set out in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that will have the effect of ending the harm caused by smoking by stopping people smoking, bringing smoking to an end. The second thing that I think is particularly relevant is that the sorts of activities that the industry does that are intended to present it as socially responsible are essentially a marketing and a public relations strategy, and they fall very solidly within the WHO FCTC definition of advertising, promotion and sponsorship. So there is a very clear structure, a mandate for us to reject these activities, and there's a very clear motive, a bad motive that the industry has to pursue them. It's important to talk about this, to be clear about it, because it's something which tobacco control experts are sometimes not as comfortable with as with other aspects of this. So a survey that we conducted recently showed that, as you'd expect, because smoking tobacco is primarily a health issue, that there is more confidence talking about the health impacts of smoking than there is about the environmental impacts and actually the economic impacts as well. So it's important that people understand what's involved. So to understand the impact of the tobacco industry, we conducted a complete life cycle analysis, starting with tobacco cultivation, the curing and drying the tobacco, its processing, the manufacturing of cigarettes, their distribution, finally disposal. Using the best available information, using a sort of transparent model so the assumptions are available. And we published this 5 or 6 years ago now. And it shows that the tobacco industry has a very substantial impact. So at that stage, when about 6 trillion cigarettes a year were being manufactured, the impact was enormous. A huge amount of energy was being used. More than 80 megatons of CO2 equivalent, the size of a medium-sized country, and in fact that's around 0.25% of the total global carbon footprint is attributable just to the tobacco industry. And what we show that with the sort of the deforestation, the transformation of land from farming to cultivating tobacco, a very needy crop, one that needs a lot of of labor and pesticides and either fertilizer or continual land clearance, that you have a sort of a very bad crop with a very substantial amount of the environmental impact of tobacco comes from just growing and curing the leaves. So there's not really any way around that, however you manufacture the cigarettes or run your supply chain subsequently. And this, we looked across more than a dozen different aspects: climate change, eutrophication, toxicity in the land, fresh water, and in the sea, use of water, use of metals. And the point of this graph is that the two bottom colors, the red and the yellow in this, are tobacco farming and tobacco curing. So those are the bulk of for most of these elements, for the climate change and damage to land, the use of water, the transformation of land, and so on. The bulk of the impact that tobacco has, tobacco farming and tobacco industry, are based on on cultivation curing, and those are things that are happening in almost all in low and middle income countries, and often in countries where there is an acute problem with food supply. So essentially that country's food production is being diverted into tobacco cultivation. And I'm very struck by this quote that Paul DeSanco, who's a manager in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, who said, "My country, Malawi, has lost most of its forests to tobacco." That was at the previous tobacco control framework convention meeting in Geneva. So this is this is the real human impact that the industry is having. It is both metaphorically and literally burning the resources of the poorest countries in the world. So the sorts of tactics that can be involved in greenwashing include claiming to be on track to achieve some target a long time in the future, being very vague, using sort of these labels very non-specifically, highlighting some minor change as if it's a huge thing, saying that your product has one good environmental attribute and ignoring everything else that happens. Avoiding practices that you're not engaging in anyway, and somehow trying to present the product as being green because of one particular element of it, where the overall cycle of the product is very environmentally damaging. And the industry is really pushing on this. So if you just search tobacco environment or one of the or one of the big transnational tobacco industry companies and just put in its name and environment, you'd think, given the enormous harm they cause, that you would get lots and lots of stuff about that. But of course, what you get is the corporate social responsibility greenwashing material. So Philip Morris, you have a picture of trees. They're embedding sustainability in all we do. Obviously, Philip Morris kills on average around 1 million people every year, which is not a very sustainable activity. Similarly, JTI is going to be net zero by 2050, which is I'm sure they'd like to be, but it's a long way down the line. British American Tobacco want to show us some pictures of trees. Imperial brands want to show us that the Financial Times says that they're a climate leader, even though, again, they're causing a huge amount of deforestation and so on. So again, just to really hammer home this message, most of the corporate social responsibility reports that the industry produces will ignore tobacco farming, tobacco leaf curing. So they'll talk about how they've got electric trucks, or that they're reducing the amount of water that is used when people flush the toilets in their cafeterias or whatever, but not the basic fundamental fact that they're kind of despoiling huge amounts of the planet by growing this useless, lethal crop and then burning an enormous amount of wood in order to cure the leaves. And it also comes back to health. So healthcare overall is responsible for about 5% of global greenhouse emissions, and smoking is responsible for about 5% of all healthcare spend. So the tobacco industry, through its product life cycle, is responsible for about 0.25% of the whole of humanity's carbon footprint, And if you add in the carbon cost of the health harms it causes, you're getting towards 0.5% of the whole of humanity's carbon footprint at the moment. So this is quite a substantial amount, given that it is completely unnecessary. So to sort of finish, greenwashing by the tobacco industry is intended to divert from meaningful action. The only way that you can reduce the carbon footprint of tobacco is to stop people smoking and end the use of tobacco products. The only legitimate, reasonable response to the tobacco industry's the harms it causes is to make it responsible to pay for the externalities, a sort of polluter pays response, so that it is responsible for cleaning up all the mess that it causes. The arguments they use, since there's some kind of reduction in waste instead of stopping the production at all, it also allows the industry to sort of say, well, we're going to do it, but this is the timeline. We're going to be net zero in 2050. We're going to, they should not be setting the timeline. They should be being told what to do and made to do it. And finally, it's just, this gives the idea that there is some kind of common goal that we sort of rational people would have with an industry that is engaged in killing people for profit. There is no commonality. And finally, thanks for listening. And here are a few sources of sort of more detailed information about this, which I think will be shared after the seminar is over. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And you brought up some very important points. One is the fact that our community, the public health community, is not feeling very confident yet in addressing the environmental impacts of tobacco, despite their being quite significant. And I think this is interesting because some of our friends attended the Tobacco Expo in Geneva 2 weeks ago. And that's a meeting of tobacco industry experts. And the representatives apparently from BAT, the leadership of BAT and tobacco companies apparently had a meeting at that Tobacco Expo, where we had a few moles there, fortunately. And apparently they raised their hand about the key events to watch for 2025 and where to engage politically. And one of the big ones is obviously the environmental treaties, particularly like the plastic treaty to end plastic pollution, for example, as well as the COP11 for the FCTC. But it was interesting that the tobacco industry is really viewing environmental platforms are key areas to watch. And you also mentioned the external producer responsibility, a key function and very critical to address a lot of harmful externalities. The problem we're having with that in Spain and a few countries is that the industry is use those platforms, unfortunately, to be part of the eco organizations that are then implementing the cleanup bots or responsible cleanup, and using that as a platform also for greenwashing, which is a problem. And I'm sure we'll get to that during the Q&A. But the next presentation also then ties into this. And we're very lucky today to have Dr. Thomas Novotny, Professor Emeritus at San Diego State University School of Public Health, who's the founder of Cigarette Butts Pollution Project, and who's an expert on this topic. And we'll highlight the cigarette fraud and why it's time to ban those filters, and how this local policy has an impact with global and international policy being discussed at this moment. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Laurent, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this celebration of World No Tobacco Day, one of our high holy days of tobacco control. And we've been talking about the filter fraud for some time, and it was called to my attention some time ago by Robert Proctor, who's a professor of the history of science, in his book, The Golden Holocaust. And he talked about filters being the deadliest fraud in the history of human civilization, which is a very powerful statement. But I think he's in large part right, because filter, the word itself, means that you're removing things, harmful substances from, in this case, inhaled smoke. And it doesn't. It changes the way we measure the smoke in terms of machine measured tar and nicotine. But if it were really a filter that filters out the harmful substances, we would not have seen the increase in the health consequences of smoking over the last several decades. Right now, the main purpose, I think, it should be clear. And this is, again, something that Robert Proctor pointed out in a very kind of simple ways to lower the cost of manufacturing. Cellulose acetate is actually cheaper than tobacco leaf, and cellulose acetate is the plastic that is on about, well, more than 90% of filters globally. And to keep tobacco bits from entering the mouths of smokers. It makes it easier to smoke. It makes it more clean to smoke. And to convince people into thinking, and this is the most important thing, I think, in terms of the fraud, that filtered cigarettes are somehow safer. And we can see the history of this as we go forward. Let me see if I can get these slides to move here. There we go. And then again, the interesting thing about this filter that's on more than 90%, there's some filters that are not cellulose acetate, but they're really hard to find actually here in the United States. Cellulose acetate, it's a poorly degradable, not completely undegradable, but poorly degradable bioplastic, which means that it's not petroleum-based. It comes from plant-based material. And it's in a fibrous acetate strand that is the composition. This is called a tow, that is the manufactured filter, which is actually manufactured not by tobacco companies, but by chemical companies. And it has 12 to 15,000 cellulose acetate strands that become an opportunity to produce microplastics when they're disposed in the environment. Again, they're designed to accumulate some of the toxic components, chemicals, particulates, and so as a result of that, the ones that they do accumulate can leach out into the environment when discarded. And many of these are toxic, hazardous waste products. Nicotine is labeled as such. Nicotine has in the past been used as a pesticide. And of course, there are the carcinogens and the particles that are filtered and the gases that still pass on to the consumer, but yet are present in the discarded cigarette butt as toxic hazardous waste. The history of this, I think, is important to understand because it demonstrates, one, the power of information to change markets as well as behavior, dating back to the Royal College of Physicians report in the UK about smoking and lung cancer and the linkage and the causality that represented, and in the 1965 U.S. Surgeon General's report, which was a monumental effort to show the causality of cigarettes and serious diseases. And that the response to this, even before these reports, was that we've got to make cigarettes safer somehow. The industry was realized that this was going to change people's perception of what is appropriate, in terms of the use of tobacco, and the chemistry was pursued as a way of reducing the carcinogens, but the filter was really the big ticket item. Advertising, even in medical journals, such as that shown in the bottom of this slide. And then I think the important thing is here in the United States, at least this is a good demonstration of what the market did. That is, when cigarette sales of filtered cigarettes versus unfiltered cigarettes changed between 1925 to 1995, such that by the 1990s, almost all cigarettes had filters on them. That's a major, important historical kind of understanding I think that we all need to have. But what also resulted from that change was a study of the filtered cigarettes and what they were able to do or not able to do. The National Cancer Institute here in the United States, the U.S. Surgeon General's reports, studies in Japan showed that the risks of smoking actually increased over the decades that the filter became normative. And one I want to point out to you here is just the mortality of lung cancer. And this is, when we talk about risk, it means we compare lung cancer in those who smoke compared to those who don't smoke. So in the 1950s, the risk was 2.7 times for smokers compared to non-smokers. But in the 2000s, we've been able to measure these risks with cancer surveillance that gave us a good picture of the population risk, and it rose to 25.7. And that is just an enormous increase during the time that filters became the dominant form of smoking, filtered cigarettes. that would really suggest that they didn't do a darn bit of good, and in fact, maybe made things worse. We also have looked at what people believe, and I think this is where we start thinking about the filter as fraud, where smokers and non-smokers both believe that filters did some good. The word filter itself sort of suggests that. We've got some recent surveys shown on the right side of this slide that show that there's still this persistent belief about the filters being somewhat helpful. And this is something that I think spreads into decision makers, policymakers, such that they're very reluctant to think about changing the cigarette because the filters become so normatively attached to cigarettes that it's like what is expected in a cigarette. And it implies effective removal of harmful substances. And instead of calling it a filter, I'd like to call it an additive because it's attached to the cigarette, not integrated into the tobacco product itself. So it makes it more easy to inhale deeply into the lungs, and especially the ventilated filters. And this is one of the technological advances that were promoted by the industry as they realized that filters couldn't filter out everything, even though the machine measured tar and nicotines were reduced. It didn't eliminate these exposures. The ventilation made it seem to smokers like that they're somewhat safer. It cooled the smoke and makes it easier to inhale. And what that does is it makes it easier to inhale deeply into the lung. What that does is that it puts the periphery of the lung at more risk for adenocarcinoma. The graph on the lower side of the slide shows the increase. This is in women, or it was more dramatic than among men, of adenocarcinoma incidence. And this means that it increased during the times between 1970 and the 2000s as a cell type of cancer in the lung, somewhat more aggressive than the small cell cancer that was previously the most common kind of lung cancer. And so if the filter had been effective, we would not have seen this increase in incidence of this cell type of cancer. It probably is related to the fact that the smoke is inhaled more deeply into the lungs. So again, a fraudulent add on to the filter with this ventilation. Ventilation doesn't do any good, makes it easier to smoke, makes it harder to quit. Discarded filters are a potential health hazard too. And again, we talk about the filter being a hazard to the smoker. So many of the filtered cigarettes are discarded into the environment. We don't know exactly how many. It's going to be in the trillions, though, because the surveys that have been done of behavior and also observational studies of smokers show somewhere between a third and maybe two-thirds even in some populations, some environments. And what we were trying to do is just make some sort of range of estimates. So the most recent one that I've been able to come up with is between 1 million to 1.5 million to 3.5 trillion butts from the 4.78 trillion cigarettes sold globally may be discarded. Now, again, we don't know exactly. And again, just to add on to this, there's a substantial number of illegally sold cigarettes that are not counted in these data that we get from cigarette sales information. So do we know if it's the filter, the cellulose acetate is getting into the environment? Well, I think so. We've been detecting it in urban surface waters in the San Francisco Bay Area. They've been detected in this runoff from the surfaces of the cities into the bay itself. We can detect it in wastewater and drinking water supplies and on beaches. And there's been estimates of how much of the microplastic is actually liberated from discarded filters, and it's somewhere around 300,000 metric tons globally per year. And in addition to the plastic, there's the chemicals, the 70 of which are carcinogens in cigarettes. Several of these things have been measured and monitored in surface water and in reserves, natural reserves that we've been able to study here in California, at least. And so there is this pollution of the environment. We would want to know what would happen when smokers couldn't smoke filtered cigarettes if there was a ban on the sale of filtered cigarettes. When we did a small clinical trial here in California, in San Diego on unfiltered cigarettes. It was small because it happened during COVID. We had a great deal of trouble being able to recruit and follow our smokers, but nevertheless, we had a crossover design so that smokers were their own control group where they crossed over between filtered and unfiltered cigarette smoking. And what they told us was that they smoked fewer cigarettes per day, that it was harsh, more difficult to smoke, less satisfaction, less enjoyment, more aversion, etc. And we were able to measure, pardon me, their elimination of cotinine, which is a metabolite of nicotine, and carcinogens, NNAL. And these did not differ between the unfiltered and filtered smoking conditions. So while the consequences are, well, perhaps there will be behavior change, that is consequences of banning a filter, behavior change, there may be more cessation, there may be reduced consumption. And the industry is certainly going to respond with alternative projects, reusable filters, contraband sales. So we have to look out for that as well as part of this activity. So what to expect again there's going to be an attempt to get biodegradable filters. It's already been happening. Organic tobacco, to say that this is much more appropriate for the environment. The electronic nicotine delivery systems are going to be emphasized, heated tobacco products. And there'll be front group actions. They don't make cellulose themselves, the tobacco industry, so we can see if the chemistry industry will be involved in this. Small businesses will be sort of represented in this, pursuit of resistance to the ban. And what we need are clear messages. And I want to just mention that there's one jurisdiction that has banned the sale of filtered cigarettes here in California, Santa Cruz County. They need to get a couple of their cities also on board on this, but it will take effect in 2027 if all goes well. And it's a demonstration of the power of the environmental message, I think, in terms of joining us in our tobacco control activity. That will conclude my remarks, and I look forward to questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. And that was a really good compliment to the previous talk where Nick showed like the environmental impact of tobacco farming on carbon emission and climate change, water use with the water farming, the curing and the carbon emissions. And then you show how very eloquently, Tom, how the filters do nothing for health and are also a major environmental impact. But we see a change in the rhetoric now with Santa Cruz, for example, is a great example, and also with WHO calling for an immediate ban of those of filters because they don't do anything for health and are a problem when it comes to the environment. Our next speaker also will address an issue associated with the product, and one that has been very well recognized also by the treaty, which is the banning of all flavors in order to not encourage initiation and continue nicotine use and addiction to nicotine by adding flavors to tobacco products. But this being said, continues to be an issue, particularly in the United States. So Carol, the floor is yours, and I look forward to your presentation. Go ahead, Carol.
Okay. What I want to see, let's see if we can, now you're seeing on my whole presentation.
It's going through it.
Okay. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are on the world. I'm Carol McGruder, and I'm one of the very proud co-chairs of this organization, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. And ASH is one of our cherished partners and leaders on the international stage, and we always appreciate collaborating with you. Our group was formed in 2008. We're African Americans, and so I know we have an international community. And it's important for me today to share with you what's happening over here. There's a lot of stuff happening in the United States, and there's also a lot of stuff happening around menthol and tobacco cigarettes. So we were formed in 2008 to really advocate for ourselves as a minority population, a priority population here in the United States of America. And these are some of the things that we do, and we do work internationally. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but you will have the slides. We are available we have passports, and we're available to work because this is an international global issue. In our country here in the United States, our President Obama, it seems like this was a million years ago now, but he signed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. And at that time, all of flavors in combustible tobacco products were banned. They were taken off the market, all of them except for menthol. And menthol is what mentholated tobacco products are, the products that the majority of African Americans who smoke mentholated tobacco products, and there are a lot of reasons why. At the time, it was acknowledged that flavors hook children. Taking the flavors out of combustible products was meant to protect children, but it was not meant to protect our children. Since our children grow up like other people's children do, we're not born with a Newport or cool cigarette in our mouths as an adult. We go through the stages of life as everyone else does, and we are influenced by what's happening in our communities. So the exclusion of menthol was never based on science. It was a political decision. It was a negotiation. It was a compromise. Black folks are not the only people who smoke menthol. In fact, we are probably the minority, but it's just the mass numbers of us who do smoke this product. But women smoke mentholated tobacco products. Our LGBTQ community, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, Filipinos. So this is not just a Black problem, but Black folks are used to blunt public health policy in the United States of America and the effects that has on the rest of the world. So as I was deciding what to share about the tactics that are used to get new smokers and keep old smokers, the biggest tactic is keeping the product on the market, which the tobacco industry has been successful at doing on a national level. We're making lots of inroads with our cities and our counties and slowly our states, but we were trying to get our federal government to take this on and to do what needed to be done to protect the health of Black people and the rest of America as well. So what does menthol do? It amplifies the rewarding effects of nicotine and tobacco. It masks the poison. It has a cooling effect. It's an anesthetic. It dilates the alveoli in the lungs and allows for the poison to be held deeper and longer in the lungs. And it also has its own unique properties for addiction, and it makes it much harder for people who smoke a mentholated tobacco product to stop. This is an abstract that we did in 2012, a long time ago for Singapore. For those of you who are going to be in Ireland next month, I'll be there. Please come and say hello. I'm not going to go through all of this again, but basically this documents how the major tobacco companies in the United States targeted African Americans with special programs. They gave away free products in our communities to children as young as 9 years old. They infiltrated our organizations and gave money, co-opted our media. And so we have this cycle now of addiction in our communities that self-perpetuates and that we need some help from our government to stop. We actually sued the FDA, our government. Action on Smoking and Health was one of our co-plaintiffs, along with the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association. And we actually had 2 lawsuits, and we were making headway. Rules were made. There were promises made that these products were going to come off of the U.S. market. And then the tobacco industry very effectively used some of our African-American leaders to say that banning these products would hurt African-Americans because of the racism that we experience here and police brutality. So this is showing how African-Americans are used as a tool to blunt public health policy, not just for us, but for everyone else. And that the tobacco industry cartel, they cynically exploit the legitimate grievances of our community, such as racism, police brutality, officer-involved killings, to stop selling and distributing the product that kills more Black people than anything else combined, which is tobacco, cigarettes. This is a slide, this was from 2016, showing how the industry has been using this as a tool, using our people, and this was documented very well by our colleague, Dr. Valerie Yergin, Ruth Malone, Smoking with the Enemy, documenting in their own words how the tobacco industry co-ops our groups. So this is from 2023, where Reverend Al Sharpton urged the Biden administration to not do this, not to do the ban that we were trying to do, not to take these products off the market. So there's all this activity going on in the United States. We're all rallying, and behind, not behind closed doors, out front actually, there are groups that are working against us. And so, and how this played out with our presidential elections that we just had is that this was used as a lever with the Biden administration scaring them into thinking that if they took menthol off the market, that Black voters would somehow turn against them and not vote. So this wasn't, I don't think that it really made a difference in the outcome of the election, but it was a very effective strategy in getting the Biden administration to pump the brakes on the rule that was imminent and to not put it out. So that set us back, now at least 4 or 5 years. And that means more death, more addiction, and more killing of Black people and others. So these are actually some ads that were sent out during the election saying that, Washington Democrats are coming for your menthols. This is another one. Kamala Harris and DC Democrats are wasting time banning menthol cigarettes. And our group was actually approached several times to try to get us to go against the Biden administration because they were dragging their feet and they were not getting it done. And they had the opportunity to really get it done when they got in there in the first place, but they waited until the end. And then they caved under the pressure of the industry, under the perception that African Americans wanted these products so bad that we would not vote for Democrats if they pulled them, when in fact, we love our smokers, we love our people, we want them to be alive. So the Biden administration indefinitely postpones the rule that was imminent to be published. And then when the Trump administration came in, they withdrew the rule. So the rule is now on a shelf. And that means that more people will smoke and more people will pick up smoking and using these products, including vaping products. So this is our dragon here with multiple heads. And I love the webinar that we had today because it's addressing the different issues. So just as they do have different products and different tactics, so must we. And we must approach from the environment, from the, which is so harmful, and all the other issues that impact this issue. I'm going to share these and then I'm going to stop. So in California, the state of California, one of our biggest states, we managed to pass a law banning the sale of menthol and flavored tobacco products. The tobacco industry did a referendum. We had to put it on the ballot. And then when it was successful, they simply put out new products that don't have menthol, but mimic the qualities of menthol. And these are on the market right now. So it makes us play whack-a-mole. And that's why the end game is so important, because we can't keep chasing the industry as they change and metamorphose into other products. This is cool. So these products still killing Black folks. So this is only in California, these products, I think, and in Massachusetts as well. I'm going to close here, and I just love my mighty Maori people. They fight like we fight in the States. And so our New Zealand law is still a work in action, but we gather strength from each other, and we know that this fight continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for reminding us like we have to, just like the industry, we have to use all the platforms available to us to advance health. And just like they're using not only modifying products, but using environment, human rights, women's rights, et cetera, all those platforms, we also have to engage in those, given that tobacco goes beyond health. So we have now ample time. We have almost 20 minutes, not quite, but for Q&A. So I encourage everyone to send your questions using the Q&A. I have some questions that were sent to me directly. For the panel, we'll have the 3 panelists who just presented. We'll be also joined by George Matt, Professor Matt, who's a tenured professor of psychology in the College of Science at San Diego State University, and a faculty member of the Moores Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of California, San Diego. And he works as also an expert on the environmental impacts of tobacco products. So the first question, and you mentioned this, Carol, that science supports us. Science is on our side, and I think that's true on the menthol side, on the menthol ban, evidence very clearly suggests that. And the science also is on our side now around the filter ban. And at the same time, also, polls from the general population suggest that menthol bans are popular. Filter ban is also popular among the general population, if I understand correctly from the polls that have been conducted. And the same is happening with endgame policies around tobacco control. So why is progress being so slow, given that the evidence is on our side on those tobacco control policies, in the case of menthol, but even on environmental policies. Menthol, do you want to go first, maybe Carol? And I'd be curious to hear Tom and Nick and maybe George if they have thoughts on that. Carol, you go first.
Yeah, so corporate greed and corporate profits, it's, everything is in, and we have, I'd say, and unfortunately now we don't have any more research because our government has defunded a lot of the research now in the United States of America. But we do know what tobacco does, and we don't need to continue to study it forever. We need elected officials that have the political will to do what needs to be done. And so in our country, in the United States, we do at least are able to, we have the authority as municipalities, as cities. So we have many cities, over 100, that have enacted their own laws to protect. As San Diego, they enacted a law around tobacco butts, cigarette butts. So we work city by city, state by state. It's a lot slower process, but we are still working. But it's the local officials that have to look their constituents in the eye. They're closer to us, so it's harder for them to distance and to spew the rhetoric of the tobacco industry and delay doing something meaningful for our people and the country, our children.
But I do wonder, to some extent, then, is there also maybe a lack of political courage from politicians, even though it's demonstrated the public supports it? And I'm curious to hear, for example, from our colleagues in the UK, Nick, for example, Rishi Sunak had conducted his own research, understanding his own polling was really suggesting an appetite from the general public in the UK for going further with tobacco control, and that's why TFG has now been implemented. But why aren't we moving forward faster with filter bans, for example, and stronger political support for that?
I mean, I think that it's a very sort of broad question. I mean, I think the main block to progress is the tobacco industry, and the things that the tobacco industry have are money and a series of superficially convincing but very bad arguments. So the sort of slogan that we have in the UK now is no one starts, everyone stops, no profit in tobacco. And what we need to think about, going back to this business about externalities, is making the tobacco industry actually pay for the harm that it causes, the environmental harm, the health harms, and so on. So it was very exciting that at the moment that the tobacco-based bill sort of passed its first reading in the House of Commons, and there's no doubt that it will get into law. I mean, has big cross-party support, but there was a sort of parliamentary report saying, well, that's great, what next? There's a very strong push for a polluter pays levy on the tobacco industry, which would essentially cap its profits, and would bring hundreds of millions of pounds, just take it away from the industry, which could then be spent to try and fix some of the mess. But also, if you take the industry's money away, it's no longer able to influence people, and it has bad economic arguments. It says that it's important for the economy. In fact, smoking wrecks the economy. It's terrible for productivity. People leave the workforce early. They get sick. The reduced tax take from the fact that people aren't working is in fact much bigger than the excise taxes that government is getting from the industry directly. I mean, it's there's kind of tenfold difference between the tax take and the hit to the economy from smoking, and then there's all the environmental stuff, which is so I think that there's, I mean, it's familiarity with those arguments, and again, convincing politicians that if they do tobacco control, it will be popular, and obviously precedent is really important for that. Nobody, there's never any pressure to reverse tobacco control measures once they're in. Everyone says, yeah, that's great. Why didn't we do it sooner? And producing polling and making it as much as possible a kind of cross-party thing that everybody agrees.
Tom, do you want to add to anything?
Yeah, I think again, correcting misinformation is really important. Carol did a great job of explaining how that really has been, a huge issue with menthol. But we know that people don't know that cigarette filters are made out of plastic. And this plastic treaty that's coming up, that the United Nations Environment Program has been organizing sessions for planning. It's going to be a real problem from the petroleum industry side. The tobacco industry hasn't gotten into that act yet, but this is an opportunity to ban and really call out the plastic filter as the most common source of trash in the entire world in terms of collected trash. That's an astounding statement. Most people don't know that, but it is the truth, and is something that can be used by environmental advocates, which is a great partnership in that particular case. The one thing I want to say is that it's all filters that we want to get rid of, because the biodegradable are still going to leach out the chemicals. They're going to make it easier to smoke, and they'll actually reduce the guilt issue when it comes to environmental consciousness on the part of smokers. There was a question that was referred to me. Did the 1962 UK report get much attention? Well, I assume it did. I was pretty young at the time, so I don't remember seeing it. But I do remember, even in the 1965, there was a huge amount of attention to the fact that cigarettes caused these horrible diseases. And I think the more attention we bring publicly, the better chances we have of getting these regulatory things to pass. Now, Carol mentioned the work at the community level. I think that's important. A lot of the clean indoor air legislation that's been so successful started at the community level. There's one community in the United States, Baltimore, that is suing the tobacco industry for the costs of tobacco product waste. They have a really interesting set of arguments, one of which is that it's a defective product, that the public was not warned about this plastic piece that gets then, non-poorly biodegradable. So there's hope for litigation, I think, in the future on this, as well as it has been for the healthcare costs of smoking that Nick has mentioned.
And let me just jump in. So with Baltimore is ground zero for the whole issue with Newport cigarettes. Anything that you see that we had also a lot of substance abuse and addiction there. And so we have a very young, forward-thinking mayor in Baltimore, governor, and we're looking for great things out of Baltimore and Maryland. So I'm glad that you highlighted them, because we've been following that as well.
And that litigation, for now, if I understand, is being brought back to another court at this stage and is pending to hear.
They've been winning every time the industry has tried to change it to the federal court from the state court. They've been able to successfully resist that, and it's in motions right now, motion to dismiss, et cetera, but they're feeling somewhat confident, or at least.
And they sued, and they got money from the opioid industry. Yeah. So they got some smart people there. We're very hopeful.
So that when that case goes through, and there were other lawsuits related to filters. There was the famous in the Netherlands, obviously, the filter fraud case, in France also, where I think on the merits, actually, also the science proved that the lawsuit was at merit, but because they suggested to go through other channels because it was a still illegal product in the Netherlands. But so I'm going to go to a question on the biodegradability of biodegradable filters, because as is being pointed out as one of the tactics, as filter bans will most likely be coming up and be related to the plastic pollution and so on and so forth. But as you point out, Tom, we want to ban all filters, because even if they were made out of a fully biodegradable product, they still be a toxic product that cannot be just discarded in the environment. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Because that's obviously something that can confuse the general public a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, they've tried biodegradable filters in the past because they knew that this issue was going to come up. This was like 20 years ago, and they weren't able to come up with something that was marketable. So the cellulose acid is just, as a consumer preference, is just so dominant that it's difficult for them to come up with something new. There are techie related partnerships that are arising. I mean, this is, an opportunity for the techie industry to come up with something that, appeals to younger smokers that they can then relate to as an environmental protection. But the biodegradable filter is still going to leach out chemicals that we have demonstrated over and over again, toxic chemicals that affect not just wildlife, but also plants, and we've shown that it can be these chemicals can actually bioaccumulate in potential food sources for the human consumption. And so it's that's what they're going to do, but it's not going to work because the filter is a filter that still doesn't eliminate the risk of smoking.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead.
how about then also the other nicotine delivery products? A number of jurisdictions are banning or phasing out single-use nicotine delivery devices
Yeah.
that are made out of plastic. How do you see that trend? Because that's also an environmental, and in some places where now you start seeing.
That's a big deal. The UK has banned single-use vapes. In several other places, the state here is doing that. These are electronic waste products as well as lithium battery waste products that are already labeled as hazardous, toxic hazardous waste products by the Environmental Protection Agency. So that's another environmental, kind of opportunity to say, look, nicotine is in the filters as well as these electronic delivery devices that make them toxic hazardous waste. I was going to suggest Dr. Matt might want to talk a little bit about what's going on with that on a regulatory basis, some of the thoughts that we've been putting forward on that as well.
Go ahead, Dr. Matt.
Just a couple of comments. I was really impressed by the 3 presentations and what is being shared across in terms of issues. So just the fact that both filters and menthol are really designed to get humans addicted and keep them addicted. And I think one of the big, of course, core issues of tobacco use is addiction. So I think we shouldn't overlook the addiction part and the unmasking that we need to do about addiction. It's not an issue of personal responsibility and personal autonomy of smokers wanting to smoke. It's an industry that is designed to get young people addicted and keep them addicted. I think that requires significant efforts to unmask, to make sure that the responsibility is put in places where they deserve to be put. Just this morning, I was looking up the net income of Philip Morris just for the last quarter. It's $2.68 billion. And I think Nick pointed out, there's money behind this. There's a lot of money behind it. And with money comes power, with money comes interest and influence. And it's influence that is being used to manipulate the public opinion. And one issue that comes up here in the US, every time we talk about restricting tobacco use, is personal responsibility. There's something about the smoker that makes the smoker have a right, or they serve the smoker. I think we really need to make sure that we attribute responsibility to the producers for the addiction, for the harm that's being done, and that we unmask and draw attention to the toxic legacy of tobacco use in both the outdoor environment, but also the indoor environment. That's been one of the topics that Tom and I have been studying for a while, that we spend a lot of time indoors. People smoke indoors, and tobacco smoke leaves behind the toxic residue indoors that lasts for years and years. Some of the regulatory efforts in California have been interesting to me. Tom already mentioned Santa Cruz banning filtered cigarettes. I think that's a really innovative, powerful effort. So far, it's been the only jurisdiction that has tried to do so. Disclosure regulatory efforts, I think, are very important. They offer education, especially in contexts where there are large financial interests involved. So for instance, California, there is an assembly bill under consideration that would require disclosure in the context of residential real estate transactions, that the buyer has to inform if people have used tobacco in indoor environments. Tom also mentioned Baltimore. There's been some legislation in California under consideration for extended producer responsibility that is not going to go to the Senate for a vote because of opposition to do so. So I think unmasking is a really powerful metaphor, and we need to continue to do everything we can to pull away the mask from the tobacco industry to show its true motives and especially the long-term impact in the outdoor environment through filters, especially through agriculture, through production, through its entire life cycle, as well as the indoor environment where we spend 80–90% of our time and suffer the residue from the exposure to the residue that has accumulated over decades of indoor tobacco use.
Thank you, George, for those added comment. Quite definitely true. We need to address all those other aspects of the environmental impact of tobacco. So, well, we've come up to the hour. So thank you. I want to take again an opportunity to thank the panelists for joining us today, for their wisdom and their presentations. There will be there's other webinars coming up, so stay tuned for you will be receiving some information via email. Also, as you know, we have a Endgame Summit. The first one will be in Dublin just the day before the World Conference, and I believe there's already almost full. But if you have an interest on this, you can contact info@ash.org. If I don't believe there's any more space left for it, but there's the one, and there will be a second one in the United States on August 25th in Chicago around the National Conference on Tobacco Control. So the link to get more information on this is right here on the screen. So thank you again so much for joining us today, and keep up the wonderful work you do, and to make the world a healthier and safer place.